women in prison, a group that genuinely is amongst the most vulnerable, marginalised and at-risk groups in society. This protest today outside the Ministry of Justice in London is the latest in a series of protests throughout the UK objecting to the dangerous and unacceptable policy of housing male prisoners in women's prisons alongside vulnerable female offenders. Thank you to everyone who's participated. The Ministry of Justice claim that men, and I will call them men because men is who they are only ever housed in a women's prison if a thorough process of risk assessment shows that it is safe to do so. But at the same time, men with intact male genitalia who've been convicted of the most serious violent sexual offences against women and children have somehow passed this process and been risk assessed as safe. This is a nonsense and frankly an obscenity. In August this year, it was reported that a male with intact genitalia serving a lengthy sentence for murder was in the female estate. He was terrorising women, had unrestricted access to the shower block, and had had allegedly consensual sexual contact with a vulnerable young offender, having first got her drunk on home brew. That male prisoner remains in the female estate. If risk assessment permits this, the risk assessment is not fit for purpose. The Ministry of Justice claim that they consider the psychological impact on women in prison when they allocate a man to be imprisoned alongside them. Yet in September, it was reported that a prolific paedophile convicted of 30 serious child sexual offences and sentenced to 20 years was being held in a women's prison. The women he is held with include mothers separated from their children. The women he is held with include many who have been the victims of male sexual violence and who have been sexually abused as children. Has the psychological impact on these women really been considered? Or is the welfare of women in prison being sacrificed in order to meet the demands of men? As dire as the situation continues to be, there is movement. Ministers now agree that the current policies are not keeping women in prison safe. They agree that something must change. In August, Dominic Raab, then Secretary of State for Justice, issued a statement that allocation to the female estate would require ministerial sign-off. His temporary successor, Brandon Lewis, issued a statement that no male sexual offenders would be allocated to women's prisons, with greater use now made of separate and specialist prison accommodation. Dominic Raab is now back in post, and the Ministry of Justice policies that permit the allocation of men to the female estate is under review. There is a clear desire at the highest levels for movement in the right direction, so we must keep on pushing. What we do works. We know our voice is being heard, so let's keep it up. Thank you.
Now, some say that campaigning to stop men being imprisoned in women's prisons is a distraction from the real issues of prison reform. Problems like self-harm, suicide and violence. Problems like mothers being separated from their children. Problems like appalling living conditions. Problems like the failure of prisons to reform prisoners. Given these big challenges, the argument is to focus on a very few number of men who are imprisoned in women's prisons is a bit of a distraction, almost irrelevant. Well, I think it's true, it's clear from those who are here today that there are many who think it's highly relevant and it's highly important. Because without an objective definition of what it is to be a man or a woman, how is it possible to run prisons that are based on segregation of the sexes? How is it possible to run a prison for women? Now, the consequences of this confusion are significant, because if we can't get even basic things right, like who is a man and who is a woman, how on earth are we going to solve the really serious problems in our prison? And we can see the effects of this confusion in current policy. As it stands today, male prisons are by default single-sex institutions. Women who identify as or claim to be men continue to be held in the women's estate for really obvious reasons. Women's prisons, on the other hand, are by default mixed-sex institutions. They are places also for men, apparently, men who claim to be women. What a mess. Now, it's long been a principle of the way that our prisons operate that prisons are segregated by sex, and that women are imprisoned separately for men, and for good reason. To help prevent unplanned pregnancies, for example, regardless of the consensual nature of the sexual activity. To protect women from sexual violence by men, or at least to reduce the risk of sexual violence by men, because let's remember there are also male prison officers in women's prisons. To give women privacy and dignity in what is a very traumatic and difficult set of institutions. To ensure that women who've been traumatised by male violence are not re-traumatised by being asked to share their spaces with men. These are really important reasons why for many, many years there has always been the principle that women are imprisoned separately from men. And we need to hold on to that, and we need to remind people of that. Now, housing males in women's prisons undermines that whole principle of women's prisons. You cannot run a women's prison if you have men also imprisoned in it. It is a mixed-sex institution at that point, not a women's prison. And it places the claims and demands of male prisoners beyond the needs of women's prisoners. And that is a very old story within the prison estate. Women have always been treated as some kind of inconvenient, optional add-on to prison policy and to prisons in the way that they operate. This is a very old story, and it is a story of misogyny. And what we are seeing currently with the trans prison policy is just the latest example of that underlying misogyny. Now, the good news is that we are winning this argument. And as Kate explained, there are reasons to be cheerful about the possibility of real, meaningful change. The bad news is that this is going to take some time still to sort out, and victory is certainly not inevitable or assured. So we have to be really clear, we have to be really focused, and we have to be very clear in our demands. We need to be clear that the current policy is not good enough. We need to be clear that it's a question here of no males in female prisons. None at all. Not just some, and some of the nice ones, none at all. But that demand, though important, is also not enough. Our prison system was created by men to imprison largely males. Males who are violent, unruly, and disruptive. They were never designed to hold women. Unsurprisingly, women are therefore an afterthought in the prison system designed around men. They shouldn't be in prison at all. There is no need, actually, to imprison any woman in this country. So alongside the demand of no males in female jails, keeping prisons single-sex, we also need to be clear that we shouldn't have women in women's prisons either. They're not necessary. We should close them all down. Thank you very much.
I would like to begin with a universally recognised truth, which is that men and women are different. We all know this. It isn't news. Now let's consider some of these differences as regards the male and female prison populations. The women's estate represents just 4 to 5% of the entire prison population in the UK at any time. And women are imprisoned overwhelmingly for non-violent offences. Over half of these offences are motoring offences. TV licence evasion and shoplifting are the second and third most common crimes women serve custodial sentences for. Women in prison are there because they've committed crimes as a result of poverty, destitution and desperation. We steal to feed and clothe our children. We push TV licensing down huge lists of priorities and we are penalised incredibly harshly for it. Women are not drawn to crime. We represent just under 15% of all arrests. We tend to like things like order, stability and safety. So, when crimes are committed and we're sent down, it's inevitable that the significant factors leading to those crimes will involve things like untreated mental illness, health issues, substance misuse and financial difficulties. The demographic of female prisoners paints a woeful picture of marginalised, vulnerable women that have been pushed past their limits. I know this because I was one of those women and I called others friends while I was housed with them. We know that 95% of violent crime is committed by men, so what of the 5% of female violent offenders? In my experience of serving some of my sentence on a lifer's wing, I met women serving life sentences for murder. I can't speak for every murderer in the prison system, but every single one of those women, who again I counted as friends, were there because they had killed their male abusers after months and years of rape, torment and violence, every last one of them. On the unusual occasions that women kill, it is out of stark desperation not to be killed ourselves. Our offence is our defence. I never felt in the least bit scared for my safety around these women. On the contrary, I admired their courage and my heart wept for the circumstances and the hideous limits that they had been pushed to. They paid the highest penalty and will likely die behind bars for retaliating against male violence. They had no proclivity to kill, nor did they enjoy it. It was purely for survival. I'm telling you this to highlight again that men and women are different. Contrast this with male patterns of offending. One of the most common reasons men are incarcerated is violent crime, 40% of which is offences against women. Men rape, maim and kill for sport. They enjoy doing it. Tied up in this already atrocious statistic is that a full 18% of men in the UK are there for serious sex offences. We know that the conviction rate is 1 to 2% of all reported rapes, so we must consider these men to be extremely dangerous, calculating and remorseless predators. Just these two examples of crimes shows how different men and women are. Of this 18% of rapists and paedophiles, guess what? Lots of them say they're women and they are routinely moved to the women's estate, penis and all. So, a little bit of history. Beginning in 1999 with the admission of serial sex offender Stephanie Booth to Askham Grange, and reaching critical mass today with men like Sally Dixon, a repeat child sex offender placed in a mother and baby unit. This dangerous and callous policy of housing violent rapists with vulnerable women has rightly drawn ire and challenges on behalf of the women subjected to this affront. It is hard to imagine how exhausting it must be for those women to be constantly on guard in an environment already fraught with stressors, poor health and scant privacy. Even if these abominable circumstances didn't feature assault, fear is corrosive and predators thrive in these conditions. However, assaults can and have happened. Of course they have, because men do not change their behaviour. Unlike women, men continue their patterns of offending, both inside and out of prison. So, why should a woman serving a short sentence for failure to pay parking tickets have to accept intimidation and terror as part of her already disproportionate punishment? Why should an 18-year-old girl on remand for shoplifting expect the potential for rape and assault by a man in a wig during her stint? Why do these questions even need to be asked? And why, after multiple instances of exactly this happening, is this policy still being enacted? Is it simply a fear of being called transphobic? You would have thought that after Karen White, that ship might have sailed, but apparently that is still a worse prospect than deliberately endangering women and girls. Well, we say, fuck that. Enabling these men to get access to victims is the result of cowering behind social justice and the disgraceful policy of self-ID. The Ministry of Justice and every other organisation complicit in implementing these policies has a lot of apologies and reparations to make. We have sex-segregated prisons because men and women are different, and women have a right to be kept safe from men. The ease with which men claiming transgender status has steamrolled basic safeguarding principles should alarm all of us. Violence in the male estate is not women's problem to solve. Women are not human shields. And the prison system is failing its charges every time they greenlight a man being moved to their spaces on the spurious claim that he's actually a woman, and the hideous crimes he's committed are actually women's crimes. They are not, because men and women are different, and no amount of craven pandering or brazen pretense changes that. Women cannot rape. We rarely kill. We do not commit violent crime at the prolific, industrial scale that men do, and we are having our reputations dragged through the mire by the men who would wear our skin. These are not our crimes. And our prisons are no place for these revolting, duplicitous men. We will not stop shouting about this until every last one of these deviants is identified and returned to the male estate where they belong.
I've been writing about violence against women since 1989 when my book Misogyny was published, and it's just hard for me to believe that all these years on we're in this state where about 1.5% of rapes end up in a conviction, and the criminal justice system is failing women across the board at every point. The police forces up and down the country, particularly the Metropolitan Police, the Crown Prosecution Service, and then we imprison women who are themselves victims of that system. So women, most women in prison are victims of repeated domestic and sexual violence. Over half of them have head injuries, they have traumatic brain injury, and we lock them up and then we allow men into those prisons, the very people that they're afraid of, quite rightly, the people who've abused them. And it's absolutely astonishing. It's part of this be kind message. And I hear this message over and over and over again. It's a special requirement on women. Women are supposed to be kind. Nobody ever says to the criminal justice system, what about women? What about being kind to women? What about being kind to women who've been raped? What about being kind to women who've suffered years and years of sexual and domestic abuse? And then they're locked up and they're told that they have to share with these violent men. And I'm really, really glad that people are making a fuss about this. I think we are being listened to. It's very good that women like Rebecca are able to come and speak. But it is part of a larger misogyny which has been going on all my life, and is still. It absolutely astonishes me that people can't see what is happening. That we have a situation where someone like Wayne Couzens, who is rightly in prison for absolutely terrible crimes committed while he was a prison police officer, what if he identified as a woman? What if he announced that he wanted to be in a women's prison, that he didn't feel safe in a men's prison? This is a ridiculous situation. So I'm really, really glad everyone is here today. There have been a lot of speeches, and I'm not going to say a lot more, but I do think that this is part of a wider misogyny, and that we have to fight both for the rights of women in prison and for the rights of women who are themselves victims of crime, and they're often the same people. So thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Maggie, and I work in prison sometimes, not recently so much as I'd like to, because of COVID prevented all the activities that I was volunteering with from happening in creative departments in prisons. But I am very happy to read aloud some testimonies we've been sent from women who are currently serving sentences or have just been released. One writes to us, "So many women are in prison because of abuse from men. I'd like to bring to your attention an incident that occurred in the prison where I was held. We were subjected to living with a male prisoner who'd come from Little Hay and was a prolific sex offender against women and children. During my first encounter with him, he was wearing a short denim miniskirt, and, excuse my wording, I could swear that I could see his penis winking at me. Then he wore such tight jeans I could tell which side he dressed. He paused the medication to stop him being a him. He was telling everyone that he had to shave every day. He wasn't separated from the women. He and another male prisoner were trying to groom a vulnerable young woman. I was told that he had had sex with her." Then someone from Downview writes, "We have a unit with 16 rooms that was built for young offenders, but was changed to house transgenders. The last one left, so we've been asking it to be turned into an enhanced life for long-termers wing. We've been told that a court ruling has said that it or another building must be available for these men. This means that a really good unit is now standing empty, yet it could be used to rehabilitate and prepare long-termers for the outside world. It has its own kitchen, laundry, TV room, an outside gym, and its own outside space. Many of the lifers have asked to go there, but they've been refused because of this ruling." A third lady writes to us, "I was held in prison with a male who was convicted of rape and still had his penis. He used to stare at the women coming back to their cells after their showers. Some were still wrapped in their bath towels. I heard him say, 'I think I'm going to have a wank tonight.' None of the women got any warning that he was arriving. Normally on our wing, things never kick off, but they did after he was transferred here, and he launched a protest. The officers backed him. He was always supported, and we were always told that he is a woman and that his transfer had been officially approved by the MOJ." Final, short, but sweet testimony. "I was sexually assaulted by a male prisoner who had been convicted of serious sexual offences. He was transferred to a different women's prison, and sometime later I was transferred too. I was sent to the same prison where he was now being held. I was expected to share prison accommodation with the man who had sexually assaulted me. This has traumatised me deeply. I can't understand the cruelty behind this." Thank you.